With the testimony of William Mullins, Commonwealth prosecuting attorney Robert Bruce had finished presenting his case in the trial of Doctor Marshall Benton Taylor. But the question is, was Prosecutor Bruce successful in presenting his case? Bruce had called a total of 23 witnesses to the stand, and just from reading the transcript, most had testified to events that did not help him build his case. Instead, many of the witnesses testified to events that seemed to have helped the defense present their case. Of the first 6 witnesses, only Jane Mullins had testified to anything useful to the Commonwealth attorney. But on cross-examination, the defense lawyers had relentlessly pounded Jane. They had brought up the problem with Jane's timeline, but mysteriously the transcript shows no follow-up questions to her given answers. Although, on redirect, the prosecution asked a question about Jane's horse. This is yet another interesting question in the transcript, as if there were no follow-up questions about why it had taken nearly 4 hours for her to ride 7 miles, there would have been no reason for the question about the horse. The defense had asked her repeatedly about the statements that she had made to multiple people about the massacre. They had even gone so far as to ask her about the statements that she had made to the grand jury. Those statements had contradicted what she had testified about. By exposing all the contradictions between Jane's testimony and what she told family, friends, neighbors, and the grand jury after the massacre, Dr. Taylor's defense lawyers had completely discredited Jane as a witness. What's more, with their relentless questioning, they had shaken and rattled Jane to the point that she had stated, quote, that she told what suited her and when it suited her, unquote. Although we are left to guess what the defense lawyer had asked her, this statement and the sequence in which it occurred gives one the feeling that the statement may have been blurted out, almost in anger. Either way, this statement was damning. Jane Mullins had woven a tapestry of statements which began 4 hours after the massacre. This late arrival home had been the first out-of-place thread in her story. Where had she been? Nobody had seen her on either side of the mountain, and why had it taken her 4 hours for her to ride 7 miles? The defense team had pulled out every loose thread in her story, and by the time of the re-cross-examination, the tapestry she had woven was threadbare. Whatever the defense had asked, it was enough for her to break down and to admit that everything she had said since she had arrived back home at 4 p.m. on May 14th was tantamount to a lie. This is the reason that we assert that Jane Mullins had perjured herself on the witness stand. Trying to establish a motive. The prosecutor then presented 17 witnesses trying to unsuccessfully place Dr. Taylor at the crime scene and to establish a motive. Indeed, several of the prosecuting witnesses had testified that Dr. Taylor had been seen in the vicinity of the Pound Gap. The road through the Pound Gap was the main road connecting Virginia and Kentucky, and it was heavily traveled. The problem was that although several witnesses had reported sightings of Dr. Taylor, none of the witnesses were able to place Dr. Taylor in or around Pound Gap on the weekend of the massacre. Indeed, almost every testimony about Dr. Taylor appearing on or near Pound Gap Road had occurred either the weekend before or the week after the massacre. Only one witness had reported seeing Dr. Taylor anywhere on May 14th. Unfortunately, that witness had been Jane Mullins, and now her testimony was in doubt. Prosecutor Bruce also tried to establish an unstated motif of animosity between Dr. Taylor and Ira Mullins. Although he was able to present several witnesses who testified to this animosity, on cross-examination, the stories these witnesses told fell apart. Each of them admitted that the testimony they had given were about events that were more than 2 years old. What's more is that each of the witnesses, when pressed by the defense, admitted that the testimony they had given about the statements and actions of Dr. Taylor had occurred during the normal execution of his duties, working as a revenue agent for the U.S. Marshal Service. In fact, none of the witnesses had testified to any statement or action taken by Dr. Taylor against Ira Mullins over the last 2 years, or since Ira had become a quadriplegic. However, several of the prosecution witnesses had testified that, whether through animosity or holding a grudge, Ira Mullins had been trying for nearly 2 years to hire someone to kill Dr. Taylor. Our questions. It is upon these well-documented facts, easily found when examining the transcript of the trial through the lens of hindsight, that over the course of a 10-year investigation, we continued to ask ourselves 2 questions. Was the Commonwealth prosecuting attorney, Robert Bruce, successful in presenting his case? Or is it possible that there was no case to be made against Dr. Taylor to begin with? The June indictments. The evidence against Henry Adams, Dr. Taylor, and the Fleming brothers was circumstantial at best. A small pile of shell casings found hidden under a pile of leaves. Henry, along with James Potter, had been named as suspects at the time of the crime scene investigation. This was because of the type of ammunition casings found at the crime scene. Interestingly, Henry was indicted on June 3rd along with Taylor and the Fleming brothers, but James Potter was never indicted. Yet, the transcript of the trial and the often told story invokes the name of James Potter at least a dozen times. Yet Potter is not even called to testify, even though testimony is given that key information originated with James. As we have just discussed, the prosecution had called 23 witnesses, yet only the testimony given by one witness was able to place Taylor and the Fleming brothers at the crime scene. That, of course, had been the unreliable and discredited testimony of Jane Mullins. The indictment issued on June 3, 1892, by the May 26th grand jury had included Dr. Taylor and Calvin and Hennon Fleming, based solely upon the testimony of Jane. But that testimony was now in question, thanks to the answer that Jane had given to a question that the prosecution had asked in direct face of Jane's testimony. Jane had stated that she had been told by James Potter that, quote, Taylor and the Fleming boys were lying around her house trying to kill her, unquote. As we shall soon see, we shall begin to present the case with the defense. That answer is very similar to the testimony from Sarah Blevins. Testimony that will place Jane's testimony about Taylor and the Flemings in serious jeopardy. Other evidence. Then there is the shell casings and the rifle of Dr. Taylor. The original indictment, dated June 3, 1892, had stated that Doctor Marshall Benton Taylor had used a gun valued at $5 to kill Ira Mullins. That indictment was quashed on a technicality. Originally, the complaint was made that one of the original May 26 jurors was an industrialist. When that ruling was denied by another jury, a complaint was made that the foreman of that jury had recently served on the grand jury. The indictment was thrown out and another indictment was sought from the July 26th grand jury. This time, the prosecution had pistols owned by Dr. Taylor in evidence, and the indictment reflected that. However, other than the change in the date of the grand jury indictment and the word pistol, nothing else had changed on the indictment, which now stated that Dr. Marshall Benton Taylor had used a pistol valued at $5 to kill Ira Mullins. Problems with the case. Thanks to the overzealous, young, and untried prosecutor, he immediately ran into problems with what he may have thought was an open and shut case. He had the man, he had the eyewitnesses, he had the evidence, no matter how circumstantial, and he had the murder weapons. Or did he? Dr. Taylor arrested. When Dr. Taylor had been arrested, he had been carrying his Gladstone or doctor's bag. According to the newspaper articles, inside the bag, among his medical equipment and a few articles of clothing, were the 2 biggest and ugliest pistols you ever saw. These were, of course, Dr. Taylor's famous twin pistols. Dr. Taylor was brought back to stand trial on July 26, 1892. He made his first appearance in court on August the 2nd. The trial was eventually moved from the county court to the circuit court, which was to begin in September. The reason often given is that the defense is unprepared for the new indictment. But was that really true? Time to prepare the cases. Prosecutor Robert Bruce had nearly 6 weeks to prepare his case for court. He presented his first 6 witnesses, and from reading the transcript, he expected that, as far as he was concerned, these witnesses would win his case. The first 2 witnesses would talk about the crime scene investigation. The first would introduce the evidence against Dr. Taylor, the 6 spent bullet casings found at the crime scene. The transcript says that those casings were 45 by 75, but there was ample evidence that all 6 of these first witnesses' statements had been altered. But we know for certain that the shell casings were not 45 by 75 due to the affidavit of I.N. Mills, who tells us that they were indeed rimfire, just as the often told story tells us. The next witnesses tells us the makeup of the party and the events leading up to the massacre, as well as the first few moments as the shots rang out. John Harrison Mullins barely escaped to tell this story. The next 2 witnesses tells us about the event that happened in April of that year in which someone shot into Ira's home in Virginia. We learn from both only part of the story. In fact, a great deal about it is left out. Both Prosecutor Bruce is only looking for one bit of evidence from this tale. A bullet was recovered from the bed of Ira Mullins. Bruce asked Jemima Harris about this bullet, and she states it looked like a .44 round to her. Bruce then asked if she was aware that Dr. Taylor owned a set of .44 pistols. Although it is not recorded, it is safe to assume that Dr. Taylor's pistols were introduced at this time. These pistols were a Colt .45 and used ammunition that were center fire. They did not match the shell casings found at the crime scene, nor did they match the statements that they had just been made by Harris, or the question about the pistols made by Bruce. In fact, this will be the last time in this case that we hear about the pistols. Epic blunder. In any modern case, if a blunder of this magnitude had occurred, the defendant would have asked for a mistrial. We can only imagine that it had occurred here, but it was denied. We know that the defense had made a document of 12 exceptions about this case that was supposed to have been attached to this transcript and sent to the appellate court. But we assume that this blunder concerning the pistols was on that document. After Jemima Harris, all the questioning is about the rifle. Even though the rifle had not been entered into evidence and would not officially become part of the case until the defense began wrapping up its case. The last of the first 6 witnesses. The next and last of the first 6 witnesses was, of course, prosecution's star witness, Jane Mullins. As we have just shown, Prosecutor Bruce may have been ill-prepared for this case, but the defense came prepared to hunt bear. We have already discussed the problems with Jane's testimony and how the defense had shot her story so full of holes it would have been used as a colander. The thing is, during the presentation of the case, the defense had discredited Jane's testimony using her own words. Now, as they begin presenting the defense's case, the defense will continue to discredit Jane and her testimony. And they do so with the introduction of Sarah and Matt Blevins. As we have previously stated, when reading the transcript, it is obvious that the prosecutor was ill-prepared in presenting his case. But from the way in which the defense destroyed both Jane and her testimony, and continued to do so with their first 2 witnesses, they were loaded for bear. From everything we have discovered, Dr. Taylor and his defense team knew that there was no case against him except for Jane's testimony. Transcript edits. The second thing of note is that the pattern we discovered in the prosecution phase of the transcript that suggests that it may have been edited before it was sent to the appellate court continues with the defense witnesses. And while the testimony of Sarah does not readily show this pattern, the testimony of her husband, Matt, readily shows the change in writing style. However, we have reason to believe that Sarah's testimony had also been edited. During cross-examination, she was asked 2 questions about Jane and her horse. The transcript shows that the defense asked her no questions about Jane's timeline of events. Yet, the only reason for the questions about the horse made by the prosecution would have to do with the response to a question about Jane's timeline. Yet, there is only one other glaring discrepancy between Sarah's recorded testimony and what is recorded in the often told story. Sarah Blevins, the transcript. The defendant introduced Sarah Blevins, who testified as follows. Quote, I live in Letcher County, Kentucky, about 2 miles from Jane Mullins. I heard of the killing of Ira Mullins and others on the same day it occurred. On the next day after the killing, I went to Wilson Mullins' house, where all of the dead persons were lying. I heard Jane Mullins say that she did not know who did the killing. I asked her if she had any idea who it was, and she said that she did not. She said that they had a black something over their faces and a green strip about as wide as her 3 fingers around their forehead. On the next Wednesday afterwards, I had another conversation with her, and she then told me that, quote, some persons, unquote, had an idea that it was Taylor and the Fleming boys, because on that day they had inquired at Mrs. Vanover's where the Fleming boys were, and had been told that they were at Jeff Fleming's, that they had inquired at the Flemings and they were not there, unquote. The quotes and emphasis on some persons have been added by us. This is because in several versions of the often told story, Sarah Blevins had testified that James Potter had told Jane that the attackers at the Pound Gap had been Taylor and the Flemings. This almost matches with Jane's own testimony. 2 particular statements are recorded in the transcript. Of course, the questions asked by the prosecution is unknown, but whatever they were, the answers were recorded as, quote, witness said Bentley, Jarvell Candell, and others told her not to tell who it was. The witness heard that Taylor and the Fleming boys were lying around her house trying to kill her, and that she got this information from James Potter, unquote. These statements are peculiar for a few reasons. First, although these statements appear to be answers to 3 different questions, 2 are not separated by the customary semicolon. The second is the addition of Wise County Deputy Sheriff Candell. According to the timeline set by Sarah Blevins and the newspaper reports, Jarvie Candell was not present at the inquest, which occurred on the 15th. Although Candell was never called as a witness, his primary job would have been to interview Jane and J.V. Bentley. The newspapers record that this interview occurred on Thursday, May 19th. Bentley was called as a witness for the prosecution. He and Robert Mullins had investigated the crime scene together and gave testimony about that investigation. We do not know if Mullins had participated in the inquest, which occurred the following day, but we know from the newspaper reports that Bentley, as a magistrate of Letcher County, did. Although both testimonies are recorded in the transcript with a style of writing we have identified as a possible sign of editing, neither man testified that they told Jane not to tell anyone who she thought the killers were. In fact, the defense had hammered Jane about her statements of not knowing who the killers were. In that testimony, she states that she had not said that she did not know who the killers were at the inquest or to Bentley. She went on to deny ever saying that to several people. She then doubles down on Bentley and the inquest, by saying that she did not swear to Bentley that she did not know who they were because he told her that she needed not to answer that question. If, and this is a big fat if, John Bentley or anyone else testifying at the trial had told her not to tell anyone who the killers were, you would have thought that as many times as it comes up in this case, someone from the prosecution or the defense would have questioned them about such a statement. Additionally, these, quote, I don't know, unquote, statements started on the evening of the 14th. Sarah testifies that on the 15th that she heard Jane tell several people that she did not know who they were. Then she, Sarah, had asked Jane if she knew, and Jane had told her and her husband Matt that she did not know. Sarah goes on to testify that by the 18th, Jane had changed her story because James Potter had told her that it had been Dr. Taylor and the Flemings. But on the 19th, Bentley and Deputy Sheriff Candell had told Jane not to tell anyone who they were for her safety. They were a couple of days late. Candell reports his findings, and on the 26th, a full 7 days later, Candell comes back and escorts Jane to the town of Gladeville or Wise and puts her in protective custody, again for her safety. Something clearly does not add up in Jane's statements, testimony, or timeline of events. Now we return to Sarah's testimony, in which she had just revealed that Jane had learned who the killers were from James Potter. The transcript. In this conversation, she would say that she did not know Dr. Taylor's voice, for she had not much more than know him than she had met him. In the winter before this killing, Dr. Taylor passed by where Jane Mullins and myself were sewing, and Jane says, quote, "There goes that old devil," unquote. I asked her who, and she said, quote, "Doc Taylor." She said she wished Doc was in the middle of a kettle of torment, for she hated him ever since he caught Henderson Mullins. She said that she was so scared when the shooting was going on, she would not have even known my husband, Matt Blevins, if he had been there. She said they seemed to change their voices, unquote. Cross-examination of Sarah Blevins. On cross-examination, witness said that Dr. Taylor passed her and Jane while they were sewing, about 25 feet distance from them. She told me that the horse did not throw her when the firing commenced, as she knew of. She told Wesley Swindell in my presence that the horse had thrown her. Testimony of Matt Blevins. To be honest, there is not much to say about the testimony of Matt Blevins. But this is not because Matt Blevins was a failure as a witness for the defendant. In the transcript, Matt's testimony displays the change in writing style that tells us that his testimony may have been edited. We believe that there may have been a lot of his testimony that was left on the editing room floor. What that was, we will probably never know. But from the last statement recorded here, we can assume that Matt may have been deeply hurt by Jane Mullins. Not physically, but emotionally and psychologically. There are a lot of people in the world who do not make friends easily. To these people, friendship is based solely upon trust. They do not tell other people lies because they do not like to be told lies. To them, the worst thing someone could do to them is tell them a lie. We believe that Matt Blevins was such a man. But Jane had not only broken his trust by lying to him, but she had also lied about him. This is the reason for Matt's final, hurtful statement. Matt Blevins, the transcript. The defendant then introduced Matt Blevins, who had testified that he lives in Letcher County, Kentucky. He heard of the killing on the same day it occurred and knew Jane Mullins. Saw her the next day after the killing. And she said she did not see anybody when the firing commenced, for she was so scared that she could not see anybody. She said she heard them speaking to her, and she saw 3 men behind the rocks. That they had a black something over their faces, with a green band around the forehead. Said that they cursed her and told her to go away. She said she did not know any of them. Have known Jane a long time. Jane and myself were friends, and she knew it. This concludes the testimony of Sarah and Matt Blevins. With those testimonies, the defense had come out swinging at the already damaged testimony of Jane Mullins. Exactly how well that was done, and to what extent, we simply do not know. There is an old saying that says, "The more you learn, the more you know." We never truly understood that statement until we started working on this series. Over the last 10 years, we have literally read thousands of newspaper articles, court documents, and other materials that are directly related to this case or events that happened before and after the Pound Gap Massacre. We have also, on a regular basis, discussed this case between us. This usually happens after discovering something new. We examine what we have learned and how it might fit into the story, or how references from the transcript explained what we had found. These brainstorming sessions let us think outside of the box. This often resulted in a search for documents or other materials relating to the theory that we have proposed. Surprisingly, this method led to a wealth of materials. However, it has only been 18 months since we stumbled upon the theory that the transcript we have, the one touted by Charles Johnson, is the only one in existence, may have been altered before it was sent to the appellate court. We have already spoken about the change in writing style that occurs in the transcript. We have also pointed out that Reuben McFall appears in the transcript under 3 different names. This would not be a problem if there had been a notation about it. But there is no mention of the failed arrest attempt made by McFall in his original testimony. The arrest attempt appears in the testimony of the defense, in which he is just called Rube McFall. This led to McFall being called in the rebuttal phase of the trial, in which he is identified as R.D. McFall, which is confusing to say the least. There is another issue that, up until now, we only mentioned in the testimonies of McFall and Jane Mullins. That issue is that there was evidence of things being left out, such as a follow-up of testimony on Jane's timeline after she admits to arriving back home after the massacre nearly 4 hours later, with no explanation as to where she had been. There is also evidence of testimony being altered with example of the caliber of the ammunition casings found at the crime scene. This leads to the theory that in most of the testimony so far the type of gun and ammunition was changed from 44x70 rimfire to 45-75 centerfire. The caliber of the rifle itself was unknown until the testimony of Sylvan Taylor. The rifle was not placed into evidence until after the testimony of J.S. Wright. Wright was the last witness for the defense and testified that he had shot the rifle during the course of the trial. Sylvan Taylor was then recalled by the court, and the rifle was then placed into evidence. We will discuss this later in the testimony of Doc's son. However, we will point out that part of the testimony given by Sylvan Taylor when he was recalled by the court is still copied verbatim in his testimony. We believe that this was done to make it appear as if the rifle had been in evidence since the beginning of the trial. In the transcripts, the testimony of the defense witnesses are short and appear almost coherent paragraphs. Because of that, we have elected to show them in their entirety. But we must note that this is because of how they appear. Some, if not all of them, may have been altered, as they also seem to be missing content. The testimony of Whit Marshall. The defendant then introduced Whit Marshall, who testified as follows. Quote, "I live on the Pound. Have known Dr. M.B. Taylor for about 15 years. I heard of the killing of Ira Mullins and others. Saw Dr. Taylor Saturday before the killing. As he passed my house going to see a sick girl, I saw him after the killing on Thursday. He came to my house and stayed all night. He left his gun and a sack of clothes and did not return until Sunday evening. When he got his gun, which was a Winchester, I do not know the caliber. The clothes he left for about a month. My wife washed his shirt. He did not tell her to do it. I saw Dr. Taylor and the Fleming boys 7 times before Dr. Taylor was arrested. There were parties hunting for Dr. Taylor besides the sheriff. I collected $4 in Pike County, Kentucky for Dr. Taylor, turned it over to a Fleming girl to give to him. I several times saw Taylor and the Fleming boys together. They were sometimes in the brush and always armed." Unquote. The testimony of Mrs. Whit Marshall. The witness testified as follows. Quote, "I live in Wise County on Pound River. I heard of the killing of the Mullinses. I know Dr. Taylor, and he came to my house Thursday after the killing. He left his gun and a sack of clothes. He came back Sunday and got his gun, but left his clothes. There was a coat and vest, pants, and a shirt. I washed his shirt as it was dirty. I examined all of his clothes carefully, but did not find any blood or sign of it. I have known Dr. Taylor for a long time. He did not ask me to wash his shirt. I just done it because it was dirty, and it was but little trouble to me. I saw him several times after he left his clothes, but he never came back after them. I gave them to the Fleming woman. She told me that Dr. Taylor had sent for them." Unquote. The testimony of Mrs. Clifton Robertson. The witness testified as follows. Quote, "I have known Dr. Taylor 12 or 15 years. Heard of the killing of Ira Mullins and others. I saw Dr. Taylor on the Sunday before the killing. He came to my house in the morning, ate his breakfast, and left about 9 o'clock that morning, going towards the pound. I saw him on Thursday after the killing. He took dinner at my house that day. He had no arms at either time that I saw him. He appeared just as he always did. Saw him again at our house 2 or 3 days after that. He had no arms then. I told Doctor that he was accused of the killing, and that there was a mob after him. I heard John H. Branham make threats against Dr. Taylor. He said that he would shoot a hole through Dr. Taylor that I could crawl through, and after he was dead, that he would build a fire on Taylor's body and hear the grease boil. Floyd Branham, Ed Hall, Ed Cox, Granville Cox, Rude McFall, L. H. Gillum, and William Branham were all with John Branham at my house when he used the above language. I told Dr. Taylor of this threat." Unquote. Please note that John Branham, Granville Cox, and Rube McFall were all part of the posse that was involved at the shootout that occurred at the cliffs of the Cumberland. This posse was led by Reuben R.D. or Rube McFall. This will become relevant after Mrs. Robinson was cross-examined. Cross-examination. On cross-examination, witness stated that she had heard McFall was a deputy sheriff, but did not know it, that the witness lives 3 or 4 miles from Pound Gap. Saw Dr. Taylor before the killing, go by her house toward the Flemings. Ellen Alley lives in that direction, and that he was doctoring there. I did not know where he was going. Taylor and the Fleming boys were at my house together 2 or 3 times after the killing, and on one occasion they ate dinner there. Taylor was 2 or 3 times by himself after the killing. A brief look so far. There are several things to take away from these testimonies. The first is, just like the testimonies from the prosecution witnesses, Dr. Taylor and the Flemings were never described as, quote, men on the run, unquote. Mr. Marshall and Mrs. Robinson both testified that they saw Dr. Taylor heading towards Ellen Alley's where he was doctoring. Using these two witnesses and the testimony from the prosecution witnesses, May Branham and Logan Nottingham, it is possible to create a timeline of events. Mr. Marshall, Mrs. Robinson, and several others testified that on Saturday before the massacre, they had seen Dr. Taylor riding toward Ellen Alley's. Both Marshall and Robinson testified that he was doctoring a girl there. We will find out more about that in the testimony of Ellen Alley. Miss Robinson says that on Saturday morning before the killing, Doc Taylor had breakfast at her house, then left towards the pound. Branham and Nottingham both testified that they saw Dr. Taylor and Cal Fleming at about 10 o'clock Sunday night in Virginia riding hard towards the Pound Gap. Then, nobody reports seeing Taylor or the Flemings until the Thursday after the Pound Gap massacre. We will discover the reason for this when we examine the testimony of Ellen Alley. The final thing to note is Mrs. Robinson's testimony about the posse that came to her house. Reuben "Rube" McFall, Granville Cox, and John Branham were all witnesses for the prosecution. The transcript of their testimony leaves out the fact that McFall, Cox, and Branham were all part of the posse sent to bring Taylor and the Flemings in from the clefts of the Cumberland. This incident is one in which Booker Mullins slipped in the mud, discharging his rifle, thus starting the famous shootout. It is only after this shootout that Taylor, Adams, and the Flemings went on the run and into hiding. The real interesting thing here is John Branham. In Branham's testimony, he appears as if he is a good friend to Dr. Taylor. He testified that the Thursday after the killing, Doc had told him that he was going to meet Doc Mullins to swear out an affidavit about Ira trying to hire Mullins to kill him, Taylor. He also testified that Dr. Taylor had told him about an alibi as he had been tending to some sick folks in Kentucky. However, in Mrs. Clifton Robinson's testimony, John Branham does not appear to be a friend of Dr. Taylor. He told her that he was going to kill Dr. Taylor and then burn his body. She had told Dr. Taylor about these statements, but still, Dr. Taylor and the Flemings continued to write the sheriff and tell him where they were hiding and asking for an escort to turn themselves in. Is there any wonder as to why, after that shootout, that all four men, Adams, Taylor, and the Fleming brothers, went into hiding and left the country? The final thing about this is found in the cross-examination of Mrs. Robinson. She is asked if she knew McFall was a deputy. She replies that she had heard a rumor but did not know for sure. There are no further questions along this line of questioning. Is it possible that they have been edited out? That the prosecution or the defense isn't concerned that the posse led by R.D. McFall stated that when they found Taylor that they were going to kill him instead of arresting him? We find this highly unlikely. This concludes the testimonies of Mr. and Mrs. Whit Marshall and Mrs. Clifton Robinson. So far, the defense has presented 5 of its 14 witnesses. Thanks to newspaper articles and the often told story, we were able to find telltale signs of editing in the transcript of their testimonies. But for the most part, these 5 have been pretty much straightforward. This is about to change. The testimonies of the next 9 witnesses and the rest of the transcript are a bit confusing and are very convoluted. We believe that this is because the transcript from this point on has been heavily edited and or redacted. For example, the testimonies of the next 2 witnesses, John Robinson and Martin Branham, both stand out in the transcript for the same oddities. First, they are extremely short and tell us nothing of importance. In fact, the only thing they tell us is that Ira Mullins was a moonshiner. This fact had been established early in the trial with the testimony of Magistrate John Bentley. Other witnesses had also testified about Ira's illicit moonshining. This had included the testimony about the incident in which Ira was thought killed. This incident was the one that had left Ira Mullins a paraplegic. But more importantly, neither testimony tells us anything about the witnesses other than their names. In most cases, the witnesses had testified as to where they reside and, in some cases, how far their residence was from the crime scene. This is true for all but 8 of the 37 witnesses. This breaks down to 4 witnesses for the prosecution and 4 for the defendant. This had made sense with the prosecution witnesses when we look at who they were and what they had given testimony about. John Harrison Mullins had been Ira's juvenile son. S.T. Smith had only testified about his visit with Dr. Taylor at the jailhouse. Mulburn Gillum was the son of William Gillum and had testified about the same incident as his father. And W.B. Renfro had been the deputy sent to the Tazewell, Virginia jail to retrieve Dr. Taylor and had given testimony about that incident. But the 4 defense witnesses whose residence was not established makes no sense. Mrs. Clifton Robinson and Mrs. Ellen Alley both gave testimony in which the establishment of their residence seems vital to the relevance and importance of the testimony. But the absence of the residence in the testimonies of John Robinson and Martin Branham combined with their complete irrelevance. This makes us believe that a good portion of what they may have testified about has been redacted. We also believe that the same thing occurred in the testimonies of Mrs. Robinson and Mrs. Alley. Addressing our skeptics. We know and fully understand that skeptics who have not spent as much time researching this case as we have will immediately scoff at this claim. We imagine that the most pressing question the skeptics would ask would be along the lines of, quote, "What, pray tell, do you think may have been redacted from that testimony for the defense?" Unquote. Our answer, of course, is, quote, "The same thing that has been edited and or redacted from the testimony of prosecution witnesses every time that it had been brought up." Unquote. We are, of course, speaking about the events that had transpired just before the Pound Gap Massacre, and in particular the incident which had occurred on Thursday, April 14, 1892. This incident is first mentioned in the transcript by Jemima Harris, but is testified about by multiple witnesses. Each time it appears in the transcript, it is simply referred to as, quote, "someone shot into Ira's bed," unquote. Several of these testimonies, even among the prosecution witnesses, establish an alibi for Dr. Taylor. But we think the evidence for redaction actually appears in the transcript during the rebuttal phase of this trial. And we also believe that what was stated about the incident during the rebuttal may have been heavily redacted or edited itself. This belief comes from the newspaper articles from April 19th telling us about the incident, as well as an interview of a deputy sheriff shortly after the Pound Gap Massacre. These newspaper articles tell us a different story from the simple one told in the transcript. The incident. According to these articles, on April 14th, at least a dozen men surrounded Ira's cabin at the Pound. These men shot the cabin up with at least one bullet striking the bed which Ira lay. The articles tell us that Ira Mullins narrowly escaped death because his family hid him in a wagon amongst his, quote, "merchandise," unquote. This fact leads us to believe that Ira's cabin may have had an escape tunnel connected to the barn. But more importantly, these articles tell us that the April 14th shooting was over a land dispute in Virginia. This is interesting, as a newspaper article, the often told story, and the Vanover family legend all tell us that Ira had been in Kentucky the week ending Friday, May 13, 1892, because of a court case over a land dispute with the widow Vanover. After the death of Henry Vanover, the widow Vanover faced over 100 lawsuits related to the land holdings of her husband. According to some versions of the often told story, Doctor Marshall Benton Taylor gave testimony on behalf of the widow in many of these lawsuits. Returning now to the transcript of the trial, only one defense witness testifies about the April 14th shooting. This testimony firmly establishes Dr. Taylor's whereabouts on Thursday, April 14th, and provides a solid alibi for that incident. An interesting point here is that multiple witnesses come forward to state that Ira Mullins was trying to have Dr. Taylor killed. This probably rose from Taylor's time as a revenue agent and Ira seeking revenge. But it could have also arisen because Dr. Taylor was a witness against Mullins in the Vanover land dispute. And it could just well be over Ira accusing Dr. Taylor for the April 14th incident. As we stated, only one testimony is recorded for the defense about this incident. Yet, prosecutor Robert Bruce calls multiple witnesses in his rebuttal and questions them about this incident. The question is, why? Establishing that Ira had other enemies. The defense had discredited Jane Mullins and her testimony while she was on the stand. They had also opened their case with two strong witnesses who had further cast doubts on the testimony of Jane. They had then presented a witness who testified that the posse sent by Sheriff Holbrook to escort Taylor and the Flemings back to Wise had told her that they, the posse, had intended to kill Dr. Taylor. The defense had presented a total of 3 solid witnesses who had testified that Dr. Taylor and the Fleming brothers had never behaved as, quote, men on the run, unquote, prior to the botched arrest attempt by this posse which had been led by R.D. McFall. This fact had also been testified about by multiple prosecution witnesses as well. Now, with most of the remaining 9 witnesses, we believe that the defense team was trying to establish that Ira Mullins had made multiple enemies in the state of Virginia and Kentucky, both as a moonshiner and as a land squatter. This is interesting in and of itself, because the only motive that would have made any sense in this case had to do with land. But because of the timing and political situation in both Kentucky and Virginia, if this case had been about land on any level, it would have been damaging to both the local governments and the companies responsible for the new monetary investments in both states. But that is a topic for another video. The testimony of John Robertson. The witness testifies as follows, quote, I am acquainted with the reputation of Ira Mullins in the community in which he lived, and he had the reputation of being a dealer in illicit and moonshine liquor, unquote. The testimony of Martin Branham. The witness testified that he was acquainted with Ira Mullins and his reputation in the community in which he lived, and that he, the said Ira Mullins, had a reputation of being a moonshiner and a dealer in illicit liquor and whiskey. This concludes the testimonies of John Robertson and Martin Branham. A short disclaimer. In the article and script, some words were added in the recorded testimonies for clarification. In the articles, these appear in parentheses and in italics and consist of personal pronouns. We come now to the testimonies of Mr. and Mrs. Sylvan Taylor, Dr. Taylor's son, and his wife. The first thing we notice about both testimonies in the transcript is that they begin with the writing style which we have associated as possible evidence that the transcript has been edited before being sent to the appellate court. We have mentioned this several times, but up until now, we have not explained what that evidence is. With most of the testimony given in this transcript of the trial, the testimony begins with the phrase, quote, the witness testified as follows, unquote. The first 6 witnesses called by the prosecution is missing this phrase. Consequently, those 6 witnesses ending with the testimony of Jane Mullins are the only true witnesses that the prosecutor, Robert Bruce, would present in his case. As most of the other witnesses presented by Bruce read like they were in some way testifying for the defense. But if one is extremely well versed in the often told story of the Killing Rock, as well as the newspaper articles from before, during, and after the Pound Gap Massacre, these first 6 witnesses stand out from the rest of the transcript. Not only are they missing the phrase, quote, "the witness testified as follows," unquote, but they are also full of discrepancies, redactions, and or omissions. They also read like someone writing a commentary or a summary of these testimonies rather than someone recording the actual testimony of a witness. For instance, these testimonies all begin with the phrase, quote, "the witness testified that," unquote. The first 2 witnesses for the prosecution, Robert Mullins and John Vint Bentley, had conducted the original crime scene investigation. These men do describe the crime scene in their recorded testimonies, although there is no mention in the transcript that they were the only persons to officially investigate that crime scene. The transcript also omits the fact that Bentley was a Kentucky magistrate, and, as far as the inquest goes, the transcript says that Bentley testified that, quote, "they held an inquest over their bodies in Kentucky," unquote. No mention or hint that Bentley had been the person who performed that inquest on May 15th as part of his magisterial duties. But there are other problems with these first 6 testimonies as well. The testimony of Robert Mullins also gives us information on the caliber size of the bullet casings found at the crime scene. We are also given a small list of suspects based on this evidence. These suspects were known to own a weapon that matches these casings. Except now we know that the evidence recorded in the transcript was not correct and more than likely edited. We know this from the often told tale and the affidavit attached to the transcript of the trial. The often told story tells us that the casings were rimfire and from a government-issued rifle. The rim-fired issue is verified in the affidavit from I.N. Mills, which was attached to its transcript. Additionally, we have recently been able to track down and verify the type and caliber of the rifle owned by Henry Adams. Henry is one of the suspects named at the crime scene and in this testimony by Robert Mullins. The rifle owned by Adams is a .44 caliber Winchester. According to his daughter, the rifle is now owned by her nephew and uses a .44 WCF Winchester centerfire variant. This rifle, if it is the WCF variant, is a gun that is almost as rare as Taylor's rifle. The other issues with the ammunition casings and the rifle are covered in our Doc's Gun articles and videos. But as we have said, there are other problems with these first 6 testimonies. Unfortunately, these problems and others continue elsewhere in the transcript of the trial. After discovering who Reuben McFall was and his testimony omits things including that he was a deputy, we were compelled to look deeper into his testimony and others, which began with the phrase, quote, "the witness testified that," unquote. What we have found is that with each testimony that begins with this manner contained discrepancies, redactions, and or omissions. This brings us back to the testimonies of Hattie and Sylvan Taylor. It is hard to note exactly where to start with the testimonies of Hattie and Sylvan. Both testimonies start with a version of the phrase, quote, "the witness testified," unquote, and reads like a summary or commentary of their testimonies. The often told story tells us that Dr. Taylor was helped to board the train to Bluefield, West Virginia by his son Sylvan. Other than that simple statement, we really have no guide to provide clues as to any possible editing. This is where we must draw on everything we know about the Pound Gap Massacre, and, in doing so, Several things stand out. The testimony of Hattie Taylor. The witness testified that she was the daughter-in-law of Dr. Taylor and lived at Norton. That she saw Dr. Taylor on the Saturday before his arrest. He had started to leave the country, came to her house about 2 or 3 o'clock at night, and left on Monday morning following. Said it was on her husband's account and her own that he was going to leave. They didn't have money to spare to go through a trial and didn't want to have the worry and trouble of being hauled around to court. Said he objected to leaving and wanted to stay and stand his trial. Out of everything in Hattie's testimony, the only thing that stands out is that she says here about a trial, although Dr. Taylor may very well have left due to his concern for his son and his wife. She says that she and her husband did not want to deal with the cost and the trouble associated with the trial. This may or may not be true. The curious thing here is a jump from the questioning about Dr. Taylor and a trial to questioning about clothing and money. Sylvan Taylor testified to the same and almost exact wording, stating he, quote, advised his father to leave because he was not able to spare the money for a trial and did not want to go through the trouble and suspense of a trial, unquote. However, in Sylvan's testimony, that statement is contradictory, as we shall see. Remember that this is about a week after the famous botched arrest or shootout at the cliffs of the Cumberland. Neither Doc Taylor, the Fleming brothers, or Henry Adams had behaved like they were men on the run until this point, 2 months after the Pound Gap Massacre. Back to the testimony of Hattie Taylor. She testified that she and her husband furnished him $60 and that he had $24, and her husband had bought him a new suit of clothes, hat, shoes, socks, and underwear, and everything a man wore. His hat was of a different style from what he usually wore, and his clothes that he had were in tatters. She further stated that he had started to Florida and then intended going west. During the time he stayed at her house, he stayed in a lumber room over her kitchen and was not out during the time that she knew of. That she handed his meals to him up through the floor of said lumber room. Unlike Hattie, it was quite easy to spot a few discrepancies and possible omissions from the testimony of Sylvan Taylor. In fact, there is much going on in the testimony of Sylvan Taylor that we have decided to break this video and make it a 2-part video series due to time limitations. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living wish to thank you for reading and watching our series on the Killing Rock. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notification of future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We must remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, the Oft-Told Tale, Killing Rock, the Untold Story, Killing Rock, the Trial, and Killing Rock, the Defense are all under Kentucky Tennessee Living copyright.